It's my pleasure to present Dr. Paul DEMERS, our plenary speaker tonight. Dr. DEMERS is the director of Occupational Cancer Research Center at Cancer Care Ontario. He's also a professor at the Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Paul has devoted his career to studying, to doing research and also knowledge transfer in occupational and environmental chemicals and their impact on health and mainly on cancer outcomes. So it's really a pleasure to invite you, Paul, to give this talk today.
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. Thanks to the organizing committee for asking me here today. I'm very happy to be here. I should mention, if I realize I'm being videotaped, if I'm playing with my ears, it's because my ears aren't working very well. It's the aftermath of a long cold. So if anybody wants to heckle me, you have to go to the microphone first and speak quite loudly. I was very happy when I was asked to speak today about the role of occupational health and exposure research as being part of the front line for environmental health and protection. It certainly is something that I have always believed, and many people I know in occupational health believe, certainly people from my generation where the environment was something that many of us got involved in first. And certainly I think it was my environmental involvement that got me first into thinking about occupational health. As a byproduct of being asked to give this talk, several people asked me, well, how did you actually ever get into the area of occupational health research? And it brought back some memories from an early demonstration that I worked on. In the late 1970s, I was a college dropout and a full-time activist on many issues, including opposing nuclear power. And this is an article from the Flint Voice. You may recognize Michael Moore as the author of it, regarding a protest that we had organized that, by chance, being in April of 1979, was 1 month after 3 Mile Island, and so had a very large number of people attending. We, as part of this, held a march and went through and past a number of different chemical plants to actually get to the site of where they were building the nuclear power plant. And on the way, you know, many of the workers who worked there were all gathered at the fence, kind of watching the show. And I remember very clearly my thought when I looked up at them and thinking that, well, you know, I live a long ways from here, and these folks have to come here every day. And so if I'm worried about radiation and chemicals, you know, what about these folks here? And that was really, I think, one of the things that kind of led me to being involved in this occupational health research many years later, so that when I returned to school, that became my focus. Well, now that really is my major focus, and my major focus is really on workplace cancer, as you may have caught from the introduction, in terms of where I work today. And what I'm going to use to talk about this today is the evaluations of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And I'm doing that because that program has been around for a long time, and it, in a way, many ways, catalogs the history of the role of occupational health research in the identification and classifying of what causes cancer to many of the substances that we now think of also as environmental carcinogens. Now, WHO created the International Agency in 1965, and shortly after that, in 1970, there was a program started really to try to provide advice to the member countries on the issue of environmental carcinogens. We now call that the monograph program, and it produced its first monograph in 1972. And many of you will recognize at least if you used to go to libraries, these orange-covered books, which now we can, of course, download them all from the internet quite easily. They form a great resource in terms of telling us a lot about these things. Since the inception of that program in 1972, over 120 monographs have been produced, over 1,000 agents have been evaluated. Now, I'm sure many of you know this already, but these are the categories that those, in this case, 1,006 agents go into. And people often think, well, almost everything that goes to IARC ends up being classified as carcinogenic, but in fact, things are sent to IARC because people are concerned about the potential carcinogenicity. And therefore, the neutral category is actually group 3. And half of the things that go to IARC remain in group 3. And really only 120 have gotten into that group 1, almost all of them based on very solid epidemiologic evidence, so human evidence of carcinogenicity. And IARC is extremely important for health protection and has a very important role. And I remember when I did a fellowship at IARC back in the early 1990s, at that time there was a survey, and I haven't seen mention of the survey since, but I remember it talking about, it was a survey of different member countries, and when IARC did a classification, even back then, there was a ripple effect in over 100 countries in terms of regulations and how carcinogens are labeled or identified or regulated. So it does have a very, very big impact. It also encourages a lot of voluntary actions to be taken by different agencies and industries and others who are potentially exposed to reduce exposure. And then, of course, raises awareness. And even though awareness itself doesn't necessarily do anything, it really is something that we fundamentally need before we can get things done. Now, I believe this year, so I have to look at my dates, the people from IARC, from the monograph program, published a paper where they categorized the 120 group 1 carcinogens according to which ones were occupational or not. And what you see here are just a real brief summary of the overall results. 70 of those 120 agents, they classified as workplace agents. 12 of them were exposure circumstances, so things like painting or working in a particular high-risk industry. But for the remainder, they were specific substances where the epidemiologic evidence often came from workplace studies. Now, there's some saying somewhere about people having the same idea at the same time, but my group, because we get asked often how many workplace carcinogens there are, was at the same time when that came out, we were in the middle of trying to do a similar project, but we looked across all the different categories. And we used a slightly different lens. The lens used by the IARC group was in terms of human evidence that's used in the evaluation. And ours was really pretty much purely based upon exposure, where we classified things as primarily or occupational, that is, either the more people or the highest exposure happens in an occupational setting. Or the second category, which is what we call semi-occupational, so things where a lot of exposure may occur elsewhere, but workers are still exposed. And what you see here is just how many of these carcinogens that have been evaluated by IARC are encountered in workplaces. Really around 2/3 of all things that have been evaluated. Now, I've been talking about occupational, but in fact, almost all of those are also encountered in the general environment, where people are also exposed, although potentially to much lower levels, but certainly exposure in both areas is very common. So this Venn diagram is not at all proportional. It was really just meant to give people an idea of the fact that there are things that are both occupational and environmental. some environmental only and some occupational only. And I put those primarily down as what we call exposure circumstances, although not necessarily so. One can certainly think of air pollution as not a circumstance, but in fact, ambient air pollution is a way that we're exposed, and there are certainly many of those in the occupational setting, where by definition they fall into one camp or the other. And then there's a few things that are occupational for which I know of no evidence that they cause cancer outside of that. It's not to say that that would never happen, but there isn't evidence there. So I've just put those down as high dose circumstances. Now, I was trying to contrast some of the differences between occupational and environmental cancer studies to kind of think about why have occupational studies played such an important role. And certainly for the items at the top of this list, I think that's pretty clear. And these are generalizations, and I'm sure we can always think of exceptions. But for the most part, when we try to do a workplace study, what we get is a group of people in a workplace that we are sure have exposure, or at least we can classify as exposed based upon at least their job. They are generally exposed at levels 1 or 2 or more orders of magnitude higher than they would be in the ambient environment. So if we think of a pesticide sprayer versus somebody exposed to pesticides in food, the route of exposure is quite different, but the levels of exposure can be quite different. It's often easier to identify that exposure even when it's a population-based study, such as a case control study, because a person's occupation and industry, again, allow us and at least direct us down to identifying a high-risk population or potentially high-risk population relatively easily. And our ability to measure exposure has therefore been easier, at least historically, in occupational studies. And again, there's certainly exceptions to this. But I think these have all driven us to having many of our carcinogens that have been identified, principally being identified on the basis of occupational information. There's a few other things down there that I'll bring up again later that are not necessarily strengths of occupational studies. One is that the occupational studies focus in on a particular demographic, working age adults, but also working age adults who are healthy enough to work. So it often avoids or misses people who are not employed, people who are old, people who are young, some people who may be experiencing social disparities and be not part of that workforce, or at least the piece of the workforce that's being studied, because oftentimes we focus in on industrial populations. And there are also the thing to think about is this issue of route of exposure, which is where are or how are people exposed. And primarily occupational studies have been focused in on inhalation, sometimes skin exposure, but certainly miss things like ingestion or other things. I realize I forgot to bring my bottle of water up, and I may just ask if somebody can. Sorry for the interruption. So I wanted to give a few examples. These are some early examples. These are some things that were evaluated quite long ago by the monograph program. And I give you the monograph volume number here and the year that they were done. These things were all done prior to 1990, some quite early, such as nickel, where the primary evidence came from nickel smelters. You also see asbestos here, 1977, classified as a human carcinogen, primarily based upon occupational studies of miners and other people with high levels of asbestos exposure. But even then, the monograph was noting environmental exposure and some of the early environmental studies of exposure and of health effects and mesothelioma that began to be, I think, much stronger later on. benzene, 1982, radon, 1988. Again, these are ones where occupational exposure, so for benzene, shoemakers in Italy or in Turkey, studies there made a very big difference. Radon, again, is another one where it's a very important environmental one, but it was the studies of uranium miners that first drove that evaluation, even though even in 1988, there was a discussion of the studies of residential exposure even at that time. Now, those kind of evaluations which are driven by occupational exposure continue to this day, and these are just some ones from about the last 5 or 6 years ago that I thought would be interesting. Trichloroethylene, which is a chlorinated solvent, was primarily evaluated on the basis of occupational exposures and occupational studies of health effects of cancer. Diesel engine exhaust, certainly an important one for everyone, I think, in terms of being a component of our air pollution, but it was occupational studies of people who worked in mines or people who worked in the trucking industries that pushed that over the edge. In that period, there were also a number of meetings that were specifically held on pesticides that generated a lot of controversy. A lot of these pesticides were first reviewed many, many years ago, and they received a re-review during this time. That's true also of diesel exhaust and trichloroethylene that have been first reviewed quite early. And only 2 of those pesticides made it into Group 1, lindane and pentachlorophenol. And you see a picture in the bottom center there of a dip tank for pentachlorophenol. And certainly a lot of these pesticides do then get into water and other things, even when they're not used for agricultural purposes. But these are ones that were not particularly controversial in nature, but there were many that people have, I'm sure, heard about that were quite controversial and remain so, but that were simply upgraded from either Group 3 to 2B or from 2B to 2A. Now, there's a number of evaluations that involve a mix of evidence that's both occupational and environmental, and I include a few here today just as examples. Arsenic is an interesting one in that arsenic had studies from a number of different, let's say, exposure circumstances. In the case of lung cancer, a lot of it was driven by studies of people in occupational settings, because then, again, there's arsenic in the air, we're inhaling it in workplaces. But when it came to other cancer sites, such as skin cancer, then it was predominantly environmental studies that drove that evidence. X and gamma radiation, which were most recently reviewed in 2014. Again, a mix of studies that were environmental in nature as well as occupational in nature that actually drove those evaluations where, at the core of it, I had some discussion with friends. Do we call the studies of bomb survivors, is that environmental exposure or not? But certainly studies of Chernobyl or other types of disasters certainly fall into that kind of evidence. And I put aldrin and dieldrin here as a kind of a different kind of example. These are 2 pesticides where aldrin is largely metabolized to dieldrin, so they're closely tied together, that were really discontinued in use in most countries in the 1970s and actually have been covered under the Stockholm Convention for a very long time. The recent evaluation that put that at a probable human carcinogen was actually based upon biomonitoring, which doesn't necessarily distinguish between occupational or environmental. And here I'll just give a few environmental examples. Erionite, which is fibrous zeolite, very similar to asbestos. Very high levels of mesothelioma were noted in 3 Turkish villages. where hundreds of cases were seen in these small villages. Environmental tobacco smoke, driven by, initially by studies of spouses, later by other types of studies, which included workplace studies as well, but predominantly environmental evidence, and certainly air pollution, which I've mentioned before. So are occupational studies still the front line? Well, historically, I would say they were, in terms of cancer being easier to identify, or the risk of cancer and the exposure to carcinogens being easier to identify in workplaces. And so it played a very important role historically in the evaluations. And certainly that's had a broad impact overall on health protection beyond occupational. But a lot has changed since then. Now we're interested in exposure at lower levels and their impact on health. That requires large studies to do that. Relative risks are lower. We're now also interested in complex mixtures, again, that may drive different types of studies. And I'll also state that it's much more difficult to conduct occupational studies in some ways. And that's for a number of different reasons. Some are maybe more political and legal that people may be thinking about in terms of a lot of pushback on some of our occupational studies. But we also have not been in fashion as much as an area of research for decades. So funding is always challenging for us. Making a case for our relevance is always challenging. And our access to getting into workplaces, which used to be not very difficult, is now much more difficult to achieve. But on the positive side, our exposure assessment methods and the technology we use to assess exposure has greatly improved, and that's broadened out the types of studies that we can conduct and has helped a lot, I think will help a lot in future studies as things like exposomics come more into play. So where are workplaces not the front line? I think people have caught this between the lines in terms of some of the examples that I give. It's where exposures occur primarily in communities, or the highest exposure occur in highly exposed communities, and that might be the case for PFOAs. Chlorination disinfectant byproducts are certainly an environmental issue and not an occupational one. Also ones where we try to look at particularly susceptible populations. And where we're assessing, where we need actually large studies to assess small relative risks. So certainly the relative risks we see in air pollution would be hard to show in an occupational study without a very, very large population. I also want to put in, and this is my last content slide, just to reassure the timekeeper, that IARC still has a very, very important role to play in health protection in terms of stimulating regulation and policy, encouraging voluntary actions and raising awareness. And we're still making a lot of progress in the IARC monograph program in terms of classifying what causes cancer or not. It's not a radical program by any means, but certainly a lot of progress and a lot of things have been upgraded in recent years. And I'm going to state that I think we may be needing to organize it more to defend IARC as it comes under attack from various directions. So I just want to thank you. I didn't know if there was a conflict of interest disclaimer. Here's my major funders for my center, governmental agencies and charitables and the United Steelworkers. And I also want to thank Kate Jardine for her help and work on the classification of carcinogens. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this interesting introductory talk. For those who have questions, we would like to invite you to the microphone at the center of the room. Please mention your name and your affiliation as you come to the microphone. So we're welcoming questions to Dr. Paul Demers on this introductory talk on occupational carcinogens and studies, providing insight in environmental epidemiology and health.
I'll ask a question, Paul. Leslie Stainer from University of Illinois, Chicago. Excellent talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
An important subject. I think one point maybe you missed is the importance of occupational cancer studies in risk assessment, quantitative that is. And if you think back of benzene and numerous examples of EPA risk assessments relying on occupational studies. And the reason for that is simple. You mentioned it, that we have been able to, in many cases, document exposures in the workplace better than in the general environment. But the other thing I wanted to ask you to expand on is the political challenges for the future. So if you think of the most recent example of diesel exhaust and the pushback, Deborah Silverman's here, could attest to this, has been incredible. I wonder whether NCI and NIOSH are going to have the political will in the future to take on the next diesel because of the industry pushback. And I wonder if you could comment on you talked about defending IARC, but I think we maybe have to also mount some defense of NIOSH and NCI for continuing to conduct those kinds of studies.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm going to ask, could you?
Yes.
I mean, it's a very important point. I'm not sure if I can add a lot to what you've said. You know, in fact, it is important to have, particularly as occupational studies over the years have evolved to having quantitative exposure assessment, that has provided very useful data that I think has helped in risk assessment, where risk assessments historically might have not used so much human data as extrapolating from animal data with a number of different assumptions and safety factors. Now we're getting to the point where maybe we could be actually using human data for that. And some of that human data will come from environmental studies as well, but certainly occupational studies have played an important role in that. And I think maybe that is also where it is presented maybe more of a threat in terms of pushing on particular studies that have provided that kind of evidence where maybe that hasn't happened before. So certainly it plays a very important role.
Hi, Paul. This is Dave Swolak from Department of Energy in Germantown, Maryland. And I've got a couple questions. Can you elaborate a bit, please, on why it's become more difficult to do occupational studies and apparently getting access to occupational environments is the first question. And can you say a bit about take-home toxics and workers taking toxics home to their family on their clothing and so on?
Okay, maybe address this one.
Okay, I'm going to go with the second question first, I think, because I'm really sorry about my ears not working. Take-home exposure, I think, is very important. I think the place where we've had a good way to look at that has been, at least in the cancer area, for take-home exposure to asbestos to family members. That's been helped, I have to say, by the fact that mesothelioma is a very specific disease associated with exposure to asbestos, and that gives us the ability to look at that. Now, certainly outside of cancer, we've seen workers bringing even beryllium home on their boots and causing exposure at home on that. So for things that are very toxic, I think it's something that we should be looking at more, and certainly in occupational studies that I work, we call it para-occupational, but it's a challenging area to look at because oftentimes we don't have a cohort of family members that we can accurately follow to look at this. Well, you know, in terms of challenges, I think I said a little bit that getting into workplaces is a challenge. Historically, it used to be that you could approach a company and you know, maybe they would say no, but oftentimes we would get permission to go in and look at something, and it seemed like there was a social compact or agreement there in place that said that that's okay to do it. You didn't need a regulatory agency forcing a company to do it. They did it because it seemed the right thing to do, or for whatever reasons they decided. And more I find the door is closed when we go and actually ask to get into a workplace. And you see organizations like the U.S. National Cancer Institute doing collaborations on a lot of very good studies in China. But those partially motivated because they can't get those same industries to participate in the United States necessarily. So it's in a way easier to do a study in China than it would be in North America.
Hi, Paul. This is T. Gadati. You were describing the situations in which workplace studies may have less use, and you mentioned conditions in which the outcome is primarily seen in a susceptible subgroup. I understand that.
This is where you see the effects. So sorry. Yeah, make sure that you speak very loud and slowly, so maybe Paul has more chance to.
Sure. You mentioned that workplace studies may be less useful when the outcome is restricted to a susceptible subgroup. Well, most, at least hereditable, susceptibility states are defects in DNA repair or tumor suppression. So in the absence of that protective factor, are we not seeing in those populations the unmitigated expression of potential carcinogenesis, uninhibited by some of these repair mechanisms? So in order to understand individual susceptibility, in order to go the next step from group epidemiologic data, don't we really need to study those groups in order to understand the interaction with susceptibility states and exposure?
I definitely agree that that's an important issue if I've caught the whole question right. And in fact, in some ways, you could think of an occupational study as a good place to look at that if we have access to a workplace and can actually get biological specimens to try to look at some of those interactions between different factors. So I think that occupational studies still can contribute in that area. It's just that we're getting less and less of that kind of access to be able to do that. But not to say that we shouldn't be doing that when we can.
Hi, Paul. Can you hear me? Hey. Just a comment about risk assessment. I think, this isn't a question, I think it's under assault using human data in a big time way, led by EPA, which is trying to prevent the use of human epidemiologic data altogether, in my opinion, leaving us with toxicology as we were before. But aside from that, my question is, the workers are weaker, the unions are weaker. We don't have the power to get into the workplace, and there's less and less classic occupational carcinogens. What do you think the new workplace exposures are that are going to drive occupational health? I'm thinking shift work, I'm thinking sedentary work, do workplace programs for exercise help or not, intervention studies, things like that. I just think those are going to be more important in the future, thinking about, I wonder if your thoughts.
No, I agree. There are some of these issues now that we've looked at in other realms where I think we do need to look at them. And so things like shift work and circadian disruption is very important, is quite prevalent. And issues around physical activity and how we organize work certainly will be. And with all the focus that has been more on behavioral risk factors that people have under their control, that is their leisure time physical activity, we still don't have as much on their work time physical activity to look at. So certainly there are many issues left to look at. And then new developing things. One that people at my center, Victoria Arundale, who's here, is looking at, and as well some others who are here, e-waste and how we're dealing with electronic waste and which is contaminated with flame retardants and other chemicals, or even things like exposure to solvents in nail salon workers, a very vulnerable population in many societies, working in very small workplaces where there are very high levels of solvents from cosmetic products. So there's certainly many issues still to look at.
Last question.
Is this the old man's microphone? I think so. Paul, Jack Simiatiki here.
Yeah, hi Jack.
Thanks for a great overview. I think one thing to emphasize is that the distinction between, and you hinted at this, the distinction between occupational and environmental is a kind of superficial semantic one in many ways. And agents like sunlight, anti-neoplastic drugs, secondhand smoke, and many others are both an occupational and in the non-occupational environment. And we shouldn't try to fetishize the distinction between environment and occupation. Occupation is one facet of the human environment. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other thing is that with regard to the reasons for the declining, the declining amount of occupational research being done, and I've documented that and others have as well, and you have. Kyle indicated one of the reasons, which is the declining strength of unions in North America over the past 40 years. That certainly has had a large impact. In Europe, the unions are still relatively strong, and you have more occupational research, proportionately speaking, in Europe than you have in North America. But there are some other reasons. One of them is that the occupational environment has in fact become safer and cleaner than it was 50 years ago. And that has relieved some of the pressure from the system to urgently investigate occupational circumstances. I'm not wanting to whitewash the problems and claim that it's all good now, but compared to the way it was in the 1950s, 60s, and before, it's certainly much better. And in fact, I would say that occupational epidemiology is one of the reasons why it is much better now, and that in fact the work done in the 60s and 70s among occupational epidemiologists and toxicologists were one of the reasons why the workplace problems were highlighted, the workplaces were cleaned up, industries became fearful of having problems pointed out in their... Do you hear me, Paul? Or should I send you an email?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jack. I mean, well, I see that there's one last question like, that we would like to take. Maybe we can let
Maybe
Paul...
I'll just say I agree with everything that Jack just said.
Did you hear any of it?
Oh, yes, I actually did hear, which is amazing to me. But, you know, in fact, things are better here. At least in high-income countries, things are better. And ideally, I think if we were to push forward with studies now, I'd like to see more studies where we look together at occupational and environmental at the same time, because, in fact, I think the distribution of exposures, which used to be in order to more magnitude apart, are now closer together than they were. And it's important to look at the combination. So thanks for that.
Yeah. So this will be the last question. Thank you very much. So yes, please.
Meg Sears. Sorry, I had to rise to the occasion. It's not just a man's microphone. Yeah, thank you very much. This is... I have sort of two related questions. One sort of follows from the other. I've heard it said by a few people that the definition of a catastrophe is something that's detectable by epidemiology. And so as I'm involved with environmental health issues, and so of course, from my point of view, I'd love things to happen faster, as I'm sure everybody in this room would. So my first question for you is, what's the typical lag time going through the IARC process where you use human epidemiology to drive determination of carcinogenicity, which then drives the slow process of regulatory changes? And related to that has to do with the regulatory changes. One of your examples was lindane, which is an infamous carcinogenic insecticide. Lindane and DDT are known to cause cancer, and they were replaced by other insecticides, which I believe it was just last year, but it might have been the year before because time flies. The organophosphates that replaced them were again considered to be probably carcinogenic. And now we have neonicotinoids, which are getting a lot of attention for bees and insects, but they also are quite potentially endocrine disrupting and maybe carcinogenic as well. So how do we use what we know and learn from past, bad substitutions to move ahead in a better way so that we make better choices going forward and we kind of cut this chain of DDT and lindane and OPs, et cetera? And that's just one example. So the two questions.
Two really easy questions to end with, I suppose. I think that the turnover is never optimal in terms of when evidence becomes available and we finally get to the point of synthesis. But I think it has gotten better. But really with IARC's program, which is limited at this point to 3 meetings a year, I don't think it can keep up always on evaluating everything. And so it's good to have other programs like the U.S. National Toxicology Program or others also looking at this. Hopefully we can be keeping up with the amount of studies that are being published and evaluating things in a timely manner. In terms of trying to increase the uptake of that scientific information to turn it into policy is really a question of political pressure and will, and is probably the subject of a much larger discussion. I know it used to be I would give talks about pesticides and I would say, well, and the most toxic pesticides, when they're identified as such, get cycled out and we move to less toxic ones. I don't feel like that's happening at a very good pace right now, and there are things that have been evaluated that remain on the list here in Canada, and I'm sure in other places as well. And now it's become a debate rather than simply moving forward and recognizing, okay, there's science, let's go forward with this. So that's a very challenging area, but one I think we should discuss more.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and Paul, for this interesting discussion, for this plenary talk, introductory talk.
Thank you.